My name is Asim Inam. I'm the director of the new graduate program in urban practice. This Urban Colloquium and public lecture series is part of a new initiative of the MA Theories of Urban Practice and MS Design and Urban Ecologies. For those of you who've been coming here for the lectures regularly, have seen a slide that kind of describes at least one of the programs. So I want to do something a little bit different and show you a little video about, just give you a flavor for what issues and approaches these new programs take. So let me play that for you now. Design is about physical form, it's about materials, it's about texture, it's about color, it's about space, but it's so much more than that, especially in cities. So here, the design is remarkable because it's very modest, it's very human scale, 6 stories tall, kind of what we would call medium density. It's designed around a courtyard where the public space is the heart of it, it's not just whatever's left over between the buildings. Now, the structure that decided and really made this project happen was the labor union, which looks out for working class people who have usually very little choice in terms of where they can afford to live, where they can afford to send their kids to school, where they can afford to shop. And this is not the kind of housing that gets on the cover of magazines, but this is the kind of housing that makes a city. First of all, what are the systems and structures that prevent really working class people and moderate income people who need housing to get the housing they need and deserve? And second, as this project shows, amalgamated dwellings, how do you design modest housing in very beautiful ways? And that's the kind of deep thinking and empowering knowledge that students will get. The other thing that our graduates will do is advocate for the public realm. The challenge is that the private realm, the private property, has many people who look out for it. Property owners, investors, neighborhood associations, lawyers. We need more people who know how to design the public realm, and we need urbanists who understand how that works. Of course, from a physical perspective, but also legally. How is public space controlled? What are the ordinances? What can you or cannot do? This is a fantastic example right now with Occupy Wall Street. Is that a public space? Is that a private space? It's actually very fuzzy. And a lot of designers don't understand it, but our students will, because they will dig deeper into it in a way that will actually have a real impact on the city and the people who live here. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. So from the video, the two things that we tried to convey is one, that we are very much grounded in New York City, in neighborhoods, in what really makes a neighborhood. And the second thing is, yes, of course, as many of you know, we talk about form in our programs. But I think the difference, which is a very refreshing difference, form is not the be-all and end-all. It's not just about what something looks like, but it's really the invisible structures, the underlying structures of cities that shape cities. So that's one aspect. The other aspect I wanted to mention to you, so if on the one hand we are very committed to local neighborhoods, local communities in New York City, the other thing we are very committed to is kind of a global sensibility. And so in that spirit, we are organizing a symposium next week on emerging Asian cities, which will be here on campus down the street in the Hirshhorn Suite, which is on the second floor of 55 West 13th Street. So it's free and open to the public. You're all welcome to come. I hope you will come. It promises to be a very interesting symposium. Today's guest speaker in the Urban Colloquium lecture series is Christine Gaspar. Christine Gaspar is Executive Director of the Center for Urban Pedagogy, or CUP, a pioneering New York-based nonprofit whose mission is to use art and design to improve public participation in shaping the built environment. CUP partners with designers and community organizations to create visually based educational tools that help demystify complex issues from zoning law to sewage infrastructure. These projects are designed with and for advocacy organizations to help increase their capacity to mobilize their constituents on important urban issues. Prior to joining CUP, Christine Gaspar was Assistant Director of the Gulf Coast Community Design Studio in Biloxi, Mississippi, where she provided architectural design and city planning services to low-income communities recovering from Hurricane Katrina. Christine has master's degrees in architecture and city planning from MIT and a bachelor's degree in environmental studies from Brown University. And two pieces of good news. This just happened this week. CUP has won the Curry Stone Design Award, which is a very prestigious award for alternative modes of practice. And the other piece of good news, as some of you know, is that Christine is actually teaching in our programs. Please join me in welcoming Christine Gaspar.
Extra points for my students who cheered extra loud. Well, thanks, Hasim, for that welcome, and thank you guys for having me here, especially those of you who already heard me talk for 3 hours this week. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about CUP's current work, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about our past. So it's something I don't talk about all the time, but Asim asked me to really give you guys kind of the nuts and bolts to how we work at CUP, and I think talking about some of where we came from is helpful in understanding why we do the things that we do now. So CUP is a nonprofit. We're based here in New York, and our mission is to use the power of design and art and visual communication to increase effective and meaningful civic engagement, particularly for historically underrepresented communities. That's a lot of words. But, meaningful civic engagement has a lot of barriers to it, right? So it's hard to, have the right opportunities where you can engage and make change. If you're in a low-income community, it can be really hard to just even find the time to get to those moments where you can make change, right? To get to public hearings or other kind of open forums for public participation. And so it becomes so critical that when you do have those opportunities to participate, that you can actually take advantage of them and use them effectively. So to address that, CUP's work really focuses on helping people understand the complex policy and planning issues and decision-making processes that impact our day-to-day lives and really shape the neighborhoods that we live in. So that's kind of the structure within which we work. And the way that we do that is that we create accessible visual explanations of those issues so that more people can understand how they work, and then more people can engage in shaping them or in having conversations around how they could work. And these are some examples of some of our projects. So we work in a lot of different media. The top left is a video about who owns the internet. Top right is a pamphlet about predatory equity. This is an interactive workshop tool about zoning. And then that's what we call a contraption. That's a working model of New York City's combined sewer system. So we kind of make a lot of different things that are visually based and that address some of these complex issues that, like Asim said, kind of are the invisible things that really shape the places where we live. So when CUP was founded in 1997, and when it started out, it was a group of recent college graduates with backgrounds in architecture, graphic design, policy, kind of a range of backgrounds. And there were people that were really interested in, kind of how the city works, in a just sort of like wonky, nerdy way. They were excited about figuring kind of the nuts and bolts out. And so they started making these kind of one-off projects where they would say, how does this thing work? And, they would kind of look into it, and then they would produce some visual artifact around that issue. And those projects kind of lived in the art world for the most part, and they took the form of things like exhibits. And this is an early exhibit that CUP did. This is actually in 2001, and it was an exhibit called Building Codes at Storefront for Art and Architecture. And this is actually where I found out about CUP. So I went to this exhibit and first heard about this crazy little organization that I would one day work at. And this was a really interesting exhibit. It took all these different forms. So on that podium over there is this poster called Important Housing Rights. That was something that people could actually take away with them that actually explained a lot of the pieces of the building code that actually influence you as, a renter in the city. And then there were kind of like posters and these sort of like little models that students had made. There were a number of different pieces of the installation, and they were all sort of trying to make visible and tangible elements of the building code for kind of the average person that would walk in. And here's another view of it. And it was really, it was at Storefront for Art and Architecture. A bunch of people came to it, a few thousand people saw this exhibit. And it was up for about a month. But then at the end of the exhibit, it all went into a box that lived in our office. And so one of the, so some of these early projects that I would describe as maybe, partially successful, like they broke down the system well, they kind of made it accessible, and they reached a bunch of people, but they didn't necessarily have a life or reach the audience that could most use this work, maybe for advocacy or for mobilization. Those things still became parts of the DNA of how CUP works today. So one of the things that's really crucial in our work is this idea of collaboration. And so this is like a little bit of a piece of contributors to this exhibit. So there were a lot of different folks that worked on this. There, good old Lower East Side, which is a community organization that we'd go on to collaborate with a few years later. There were high school students that worked on this. There were artists, planning firms, government officials were interviewed. So a lot of people kind of had a hand in this. A lot of people were brought in to be part of it. And then this has become a really, really important part of how we work, which is the idea of stakeholder interviews. So this was a little corner of the exhibit where there were these photos on the left, and then there were these two screens on which were looped video of different interviews with people, asking them about kind of their interaction with the building code or their kind of perspective on it. And it was everyone from, people from Department of Buildings who have a role in actually implementing the building code and in shaping pieces of it, to other, elected officials who have a direct role in shaping it, specifically to people that are impacted by it either as residents of the city or as organizers working on housing issues. And it's really this idea of not processing that information for people, but presenting these different viewpoints and letting people kind of see the different perspectives around this issue. And that's become really important to a number of our projects now. This is another kind of early project. It's called Social Security Risk Machine, and it's basically a fold-out pamphlet. And this was produced in, 2005, I think. Actually, it says 2006. So at the time, it was during the Bush administration, and at the time, people were talking about the privatization of Social Security. So it was this big issue that was kind of in the news. And so one of CUP's staff members at the time, Damon Rich, was really interested in that issue. And he thought, well, everyone's talking about this issue, but people don't really know how it works, right? Like a lot of people are talking about it, and they're going into these particular details without kind of giving you the backstory of the nuts and bolts of it. And so he worked with Sam Stark, who did some research on this, and they worked with the designer David Reinfurt to put together this little pamphlet. And this is 8.5 by 11, and it kind of unfolds into a poster. And it's this little walkthrough of how Social Security works, like how the system is actually structured. And it's a really, really nice piece of graphic design, and people really liked it. And again, like CUP had some sort of traction in the art world, and people in that kind of constituency thought it was really interesting. This is a little poster side. But at the end of the day, there was nowhere for it to go. So there was no audience that could use this. And even though a lot of people were talking about Social Security and how that system was structured, there wasn't a group that had a specific use for this. So it also ended up in a box in our office. We learn a lot about things from the boxes that are in our office at the end of the day. So these projects, I wouldn't describe these projects as failures, but I think that they're really interesting kind of learning experiences for us as an organization where, pieces of them worked really well and then pieces of them didn't, but they started to point the way towards a way that we could work and be more effective, and that these things that we were producing could have more impact if we could structure our work in a slightly different way. And so it's not like it happened all at once. This really happened over a number of years. Like every time we made one of these projects, pieces of it worked, pieces of it didn't. We'd kind of do another one and tweak it a little bit. And so this is my formula for how we work. So our projects, they still start with CUP, because, that's who we are. But now instead of us starting with a topic that we're interested in, we start with a partnership or a way to structure partnerships. So for a lot of our programs, we put out calls for collaboration. So I'll talk about this more later, but we divide our programs into our youth education programs and our community education programs. And in all of our community education programs, all of our projects begin with us putting out some call for groups that want to work with us on a particular topic that they're already addressing in their communities. In our youth education programs, we don't start with a topic. We usually start with a partner, so a school or some sort of educational program that wants to collaborate with us and kind of learn from the city and use current issues in their neighborhood as a starting point. So really our projects start with us putting out a call, and then we find ways to get these partners, right? And the partners come with an issue that's impacting their community. So we're working directly with the people who will be the end users for whatever we make, and they're really informing the process. And then we bring in the visual thinkers, so the artists or designers, or in our youth education programs, the teaching artists, who work with us to kind of break down these issues. And then we all work together as a group. So our projects are these sort of at least three-way collaborations. Sometimes there are more people involved. But there's always CUP staff, there's always some sort of visual thinker, and then there's always someone coming from a community. And then we produce some sort of visual tool. So there's always an end product. It's some visual tool that breaks down an issue, makes it accessible for a particular audience. And then there's a way to distribute it to the people who most need that information. So we now think about that from the beginning of our projects and really structure our work so that it will always end with some sort of distribution, some sort of end user, and ideally that end user has been involved from the beginning and actually shaping the project. So that's kind of our overall structure of how we work. And then I'm going to tell you now more about some of the actual programs that we have and how we kind of produce them. So, as I mentioned, we have youth education and community education programs. And our youth education programs are based, they're partnerships with New York City public high school students. So sometimes they're in high school, sometimes they're in different kinds of after-school programs. But we're always working with students who are really low-income students, primarily from communities of color. And we're looking at issues that are impacting the communities that they live in and that their schools are located in. And then we have, this is just like a quick rundown, but we have 4 programs in our youth education program area. We have something called Urban Investigations, which are these really long, intensive, semester-long projects that we do with students. We have City Studies, which are shorter, sometimes after school, but mostly in-class projects where we're working with an actual classroom teacher to implement some project-based learning into an existing curriculum, which could be anything from an English language arts class to a US government class to like an art or design class. And then we have professional development for teachers, helping them incorporate project-based learning into their classrooms. And then curriculum development, which is usually an end product of other things that we produce. So all of these projects start with a question about how the city works. In this case, the question was, where does the food in my bodega come from? And when we start these projects, we start with a question that we don't know the answer to either. So it's a genuine question that we're going to learn about with the students, and where they're real agents in the actual process of learning. I think that I kind of think of it, a good CUP question is usually one where you think you know the answer to it, but then if you start kind of articulating what the answer is, you kind of realize that 2 steps into it, you don't really know what happens after that. So there are often things like infrastructure questions where you sort of have a sense of these things because they're familiar, but you realize that you don't know the specifics of them. So in this project, we were working with a group of students in the South Bronx, which is a community that I know that some of you guys have looked at it in other courses, but like almost all of New York City's produce comes through the South Bronx, but it's a food desert for the people that live there. People rely primarily on bodegas. There are very few grocery stores there. So there's a lot of conversation about food deserts and what that means, what the health impacts are, particularly for young people. But often young people aren't actually part of that conversation. So in this project, the young people were really framing the conversation. And all of our youth education programs start with these stakeholder interviews. So sort of going back to that material that we generated in these earlier projects, we're really interested in talking to different people and finding their take on this issue and then trying to learn from that. And I think for young people in particular, we're really interested in what we sort of think of as the innate cynicism of teenagers, and that it's often seen as a negative thing, but we think that that's actually, like, it holds the kernel of critical thinking, right? And so we try to engage that cynicism and say, yeah, that is messed up. Why is it messed up? What's messed up about it? And we try to give them the skills to take that on and break it down and take it to a more productive place. And so these stakeholder interviews form a really important part of that. So we train the students to be kind of basically really good journalists, to ask really tough questions. We set up interviews for them with lots of different stakeholders. So they talk to people who are saying things to them that sound like they're reasonable things. You know, any given person might be someone that sounds like, okay, I kind of agree with what they're saying. But if these people disagree with each other, the students sort of have to figure out what they think about what's being said to them and kind of where they, who they agree with and where their thoughts kind of go. So we train them to use video equipment and recording equipment. We train them to ask really good questions. High school students are really good interviewers. It's kind of, they don't like have a filter, so they say things that like the rest of us wouldn't say, which is great. It's really disarming for people that are being interviewed. And they're really good at kind of cutting through bullshit too. So we get really good interviews from this. So in this project, they interviewed a bunch of bodegueros. They interviewed some folks at Jetro, which is one of the big suppliers that supplies food to bodegas all around the city. They interviewed Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez, who had just introduced a bill about refrigeration, providing funds for refrigeration for bodegas so they could have more produce on the shelves. So they did this series of interviews, and they worked with the teaching artist on this project, whose name was Jonathan Bogarine. And we have them produce lots of different artwork along the way. So every time they have an interview, they kind of come back and they produce different material as a way of thinking through what they've been learning. They often do like different mock-ups where they'll recreate, or they'll create interactions between two of their different interviewers and imagine conversations they would have with each other as a way of processing different viewpoints. And then in this case, they also worked with an animator, named Andy Kennedy, who did this little animation based on the research that they had done about corn subsidies and how that impacted the food that was appearing in their bodegas. And then we end with the final product. So in this case, the students worked with Jonathan and with Andy to produce a 30-minute documentary called Bodega Down Bronx. And then they presented it publicly. So we have all of our projects end with the students presenting their work publicly. And this can happen in a bunch of different contexts, but it's often in an art context. So we might have a film screening at Anthology Film Archives, or we've done projects at the Seaport Museum or at MoMA. So the students really get to experience the value of their work, both in an art context and then afterwards when we distribute the project in kind of a more social justice context, where this work ends up being used often by groups that are actually working on these issues in their communities. So in this case, we package the video and we distribute it. So we sell it on our website, but we also have distributed it for lots of screenings and viewings in different places. So this video in particular has had a really big impact, has really been out there in a lot of different communities, and the students really get to see their work out there. This is another urban investigation project, and it was asking the question, where does the water go when you flush the toilet? And I sort of think that's like the classic good cup question of you think you know it, but you don't really know it. So this is looking, New York City's water infrastructure. And New York has this system that's called the combined sewer system, which is pretty common in older cities. And what happens with combined sewer systems is when it rains really hard, the water that's collected from our apartment buildings, which includes what you flush down the toilet, combines with water that's collected on the streets, and it all overflows into local waterways. It's disgusting. So we had the students go out and do interviews. So in this case, they're actually interviewing the guys that were building some of this infrastructure or repairing some of this infrastructure in the city, and you could see there's someone filming it. And then they made some claymation about the history of poop, as they described it, which kind of went through the history of toilets and the history of plumbing. And then they turned that into a video also. So then this is the packaging for that video, which is also, again, we distribute it. It's on our website. You can watch all the stuff on our website, which is welcometocup.org. And this one had a really long life because the students also produced, I don't have an image of this, but the students produced this little kind of working model of the system. And it was so popular that it broke. So we got a grant to build more of them. And so we made a more robust version the second time. So we worked with designer to produce the graphics for this based on what the students had originally done. And we now produce these and distribute them to environmental education centers and educators around the city. And it's this working model, so you can actually pour water into it. It comes with brown glitter that represents waste. It has a curriculum, so we developed a curriculum to go along with it so that teachers could use it in their classroom, and they could do, either like a one-session project where they just do like a little workshop with it, or they could do like a week-long section on watersheds and where the water comes from, and then how it works through the city, and then what happens to it afterwards. So they could do a full lesson plan around that. And then we give these workshops. So we actually do quite a few workshops using the tool. I was giving a workshop last summer to a group of people in the Gowanus area that were looking at this relative to the Superfund cleanup in the area. So it's been this really popular tool. So much so that we recently made an animation that goes with it. So this project has had a really long life where it kind of keeps iterating into different forms, where we're trying to figure out how to have even more impact with it. So in this case, we made this video. This is just a still from the video, which is a 3-minute animation that explains the whole process for people who don't get to have a workshop. And the idea is that you can see this online, so we'll get to a larger audience, but this is also going to be at the Newtown Creek the Newtown Creek Water Treatment Plant Visitor Center. And so again, it's going to be in this point of reaching people that come there to kind of have this education on what's happening in the system, and it's this tool that can kind of stand on its own. So this all came from student work, and the first part of the project was done in like 2005, and this kind of has had this long life where we just did the animation this year. So. This is one of our smaller programs, the City Studies programs, where we work a lot with in-class educators. And we've been working at a school called the Academy of Urban Planning for a few years now. And this is a project that we did with a 9th grade US history class. And the teacher in that class was really frustrated with part of his curriculum. So he's teaching students, and he has to deal with, the Regents exam, which is one of these standardized tests that students have to take. And he said that every year when he taught around the concept of federalism, a sexy topic, that the students would just get really disengaged. It was so abstract, it was so detached from their personal experience, so they couldn't really grab onto it. But it was an issue that always comes up on the Regents, so it was a real problem for them. And he was frustrated with it and trying to figure out a new way to teach it. And so we came in and worked with his class, and what we did is, all of our projects are based on going out into the city and using the city as a learning lab. So in this project, we structured a curriculum where the students would go out into the neighborhood around the school and look for examples of federalism. They would look for examples of not just federal, but we ended up looking at federal, state, and city government intervention in their lives so that they could really kind of, what are the signals of it? How do you know? What does it look like? And how much is it really affecting you? And so they made these arrows for federal, city, and state and kind of went out and looked for signs of regulation. And they found plenty of them. So here's them in the grocery store. They went to a number of different locations, and then they did a couple of interviews for this as well. So they interviewed an Army recruit. They went to an Army recruiting office, and they talked to him about the federal government, the Army is part of the federal government, and how that impacts their lives. I was told that he said this was the hardest interview he'd ever done. And then they produced stuff along the way documenting what they found when they went to all of those different sites. And so they were working with a teaching artist named Stephen Fine, and we had a designer named Jen Korf who helped format this little booklet that the students made. And these are the pieces of it. So it's really documenting, this is what we did. Like, we went out and looked at these places. This is what we found. So they went to a liquor store. Hopefully it will still be funded in the future after taking students to a liquor store. Turns out that's a good site for lots of local regulation. And so they took, they made these little diagrams from the things that they observed, and they labeled the different levels of regulation that they saw. So it became really tangible to them because these were all things in their everyday lives. Like, they went to bodegas, these are things that they interact with every day. And they really started to see this pattern and kind of kept pointing it out even after the class was over. And then this is another part of the booklet. They just broke down in these different locations. These are some of the regulations and some of the laws that actually impact what you see with these labels that you would see. And this is a project that doesn't get distributed through community organizations, but it's a project that's actually come back again within that same classroom. So I just was talking to one of our partners at the school today, and they're implementing this project again this year, actually this week. They're doing it now. So this is a curriculum that teacher kind of can run with now, and he's doing it with a new group of students. And then at the end of that project, these were the students. They kind of went back and brought the materials that they produced to the interviewees. And they actually led a bunch of workshops for other students in their school. So now they're teaching this content to other kids. And this was really great for them because they were ninth graders, so they're the youngest kids in the school, and they did workshops for 10th and 11th graders on this topic. So that's our youth education programs. I'm going to talk now about our community education programs. And we have 4 of those. One is Making Policy Public. One is a new program called Public Access Design, which I'm not going to talk about too much tonight, but it's very related to this one. Another one is called Envisioning Development Toolkits, which is one of those workshop tools that I showed in the first slide. And then the fourth is something we call Cup for Hire, which is sort of one-on-one projects when a group has a really specific need that they want us to help them develop, either a print tool or a workshop or some other kind of engagement tool. So Making Policy Public really grew out of that Social Security risk machine pamphlet that I showed you guys earlier. When Damon and the team finished that project, they saw how the format worked really, really well, and it had all this potential, and there were all these different issues that could work within that format, and there's so much need for that kind of explanation of different policies. And so it was this question of, okay, how do you take this cool idea that we have and connect it to the need on the ground? And that was the first project where we really started structuring the idea of an open call. And we've done a lot of work to really establish our network of partners at community organizations and advocacy groups. So it takes a lot of work, to send out a call and actually have people respond to it. So we've kind of been building that infrastructure for a while before this went into place. But it's now a program that we do annually. So every year we put out a call for organizers, advocacy groups that have a social justice issue that they're working on that impacts a particular community that they work with and that would benefit from a visual explanation. And then we have a jury that helps us pick the topics every year. So we pick 4 every year. And the jury is made up of 2 people with art and design backgrounds and 2 people with kind of organizing and advocacy backgrounds. And we try to get people that are pretty prominent in their fields so they can help us draw attention to the program. They can help draw applicants into the program. But that they also come with a lot of knowledge to help inform the discussions that we have. And we have all of the jury members involved in both parts of the jurying process. So we have all of them involved in helping to pick a topic. And then once we have the topics in place, we do a call for designers that want to collaborate on those topics. And we have all the jury members involved with that too. And so it's almost a microcosm for the overall program, because the jury members will sort of start by having this conversation where, if we're doing the issue jury, the designers will say, I don't really know anything about this, so you guys kind of lead the way, and vice versa. But they end up having these really intense conversations, and I've never done one of these that didn't end with at least 2 of the jury members saying, oh, I view that in this totally different way now. I really learned a lot in this process and through these conversations. So it's really exciting for us. Those conversations are really intense experiences for everyone that's involved, and we get really amazing projects out of these. And then once we've picked those collaborations, our staff work really closely with them to kind of facilitate the projects and bring everyone together. So we don't pair off the groups and kind of send them off to do the projects on their own. We're really involved in them. So we're really facilitating and managing the process. We pay for all the expenses of the project, like, producing the materials and all that stuff. And we think that that's the key to the success of these projects, is we're really using our time to break down the barriers between kind of design and advocacy work, and helping people talk to each other and really understand each other's work. So this is a project from a couple of years ago from that program, and this is what policy looks like in the wild. This is one of very many pages that makes up part of New York City's street vendor code. If you'll note, these are descriptions of times and locations. So there are like hundreds of pages that just say the names of streets and the times that you can park on them. And that's before you even get into like the other rules that actually affect street vendors. So this is not what we call accessible. It's really hard to understand this. Even if you're a lawyer, you would spend a fair amount of time trying to break this down and understand what it means. So this is the kind of thing that we're talking about with this program. Like, this is the kind of thing that needs some explanation. And the reason it needs an explanation is because of this. So that's a box full of tickets from New York City Police Department. And a single ticket can cost $1,000. New York City street vendors earn on average $14,000 a year. So a single ticket has a pretty significant economic impact. And it turns out that the police also don't like to read policy, so they often write tickets that are not accurate, and you can go to court to fight those, but you've lost a day of work in the process. So these things have a really big impact. And New York City street vendors are also pretty often recent immigrants, so then there's often an additional language barrier as well. So even if you could go down to City Hall and find that code and break out the book, it would take you a really long time to figure out what's going on. So the person whose hand that is Sean Basinski, and he's the director of the Street Vendor Project. And he came to us through Making Policy Public and asked for help in breaking down some of the more critical pieces of the vendor code so that he could help his members. So it's a membership-based organization of 10,000 New York City street vendors. So he wanted to help the members kind of avoid some of these more common pitfalls and navigate their way through the law more effectively. And so this is kind of what the process looks like. We brought in a designer for this named Candy Chang, and then we worked with Sean, and we worked with the membership and really tested out different different drafts of the project with the end users to get a sense of what would work and what wouldn't work. And this is a really interesting process. It can be really tough. A lot of designers, the designers have often worked with different kinds of clients, but they've rarely worked with clients where they're working directly with the end users like this. So they usually have someone kind of art directing them or telling them what they need. But they rarely walk into a room and have a lot of people giving them feedback. So it can be really intense, but it's also a really amazing process. Like we did a project last year working with members of an organization called Community Voices Heard, and they're all primarily public housing residents. And they were really great at just kind of reacting to things and giving a read on what things look like to them coming from their perspective. And that's not something that you can know as a designer. Just even things like the designer proposed a color of blue that to them was like, that's the color that Nietzsche uses, like that's not cool. We can't have that color. Like they're the bad guys. So that kind of subtle thing has to happen in contact with the people that are actually going to use the material and respond to it at the end of the day. And so one of the things that we found when we were working on this project was that the initial version of this project looked really cartoony. It still has kind of a comic book feel to it, but the original version was more playful. And one of the things that the member said was, we're going to pull this out and show it to police, because half the time that we're dealing with this, it's in a direct conversation with police. So we want to be able to pull it out and have it look official enough that a police officer will respect it and say, like, okay, that looks real, that looks legit. So that kind of input is something that you really need to be working with folks to get. And this is what we produced in that project. So again, it has the same format as the Social Security Risk Machine one. So it's 8.5 by 11. It unfolds to 34 by 22. And basically it takes all the key parts of the code and makes them as visual as possible. Where we use text, it's in 5 different languages, which were the most common languages for the Street Vendor Project's members. but it's really primarily visual. And it's not the whole code. So we have to edit these things and really focus on what are the critical pieces for this population, what are the things that come up over and over again that we really want to make sure people know. And then at the end, we distribute it. So in this case, we did like a big event with Street Vendor Projects volunteers and CUP volunteers, and just went out and handed it out to people on the street in all 5 boroughs on this one day, and kind of made a press event around it as well. And this project's now been kind of out in the world for 3 years now, and Street Vendor Project has been reordering it from us every year, and now there's an organization called Midtown Community Court that's using it in their work. And they do education and training programs for street vendors who've had violations before. And so they're using this as some of the educational material that they use in their training program. And these are some of the other ones. That one's looking at the redistricting process that happens after the census. That was with a group called the Brennan Center, and designers called We Have Photoshop. The one in the middle is one looking at the intersection of the immigration system and the criminal justice system. And that was with a group called Families for Freedom, and designers Tamara Malatik and Lana Kavar. And then this one, I Got Arrested, Now What, is one that we just did last year with a group called the Center for Court Innovation and a graphic novelist named Danica Novgorodov. And these are some panels from that as well. It's a comic book guide to the juvenile justice system for youth that have been arrested, so that they can navigate through the system, so that they understand where they have agency in the process and what kind of decision making happens at every step in the process. There's a little poster side, and this is being distributed. Center for Court Innovation works with Department of Probation a lot, and so Department of Probation ordered 20,000 copies of this when we were done with it, and they give them out to every youth that gets arrested in New York City. So this is happening, this is getting delivered right at the point where it can have the most impact. And then I have one last project I'm going to share with you guys, and this is this is what this stuff looks like when we start our projects. This is a table that shows New York City income demographics by neighborhood. And it's really boring and hard to read, and it has a tremendous impact on who gets to live where. The categories, the income categories that this is divided into, come from federal legislation that impact affordable housing development and what kind of housing gets developed, and then who gets to live in the different housing that is available. And we started working on this project because a number of the community organizations that we've been partnering with on other projects said, we're looking at all these development issues in our neighborhood, and development issues are really complex, and they're often quantitative. And whenever we go in and have a conversation with people about some sort of development in their community, we end up having this 40-minute long conversation where we're trying to make sure everyone understands the background and is on the same page before we can even get to the part where we're actually organizing around the issue. There's got to be a way to get people up to speed faster, and to also not have to explain it again every time, a way that people can kind of remember better and kind of understand the system, so that we can move on to the organizing part. So we started working with this sort of advisory board of groups, including Good Old Lower East Side, which is one of the groups that we had worked with back in the Storefront exhibit, to produce this toolkit. And it's the first in our series of these Envisioning development toolkits that I mentioned before. And the heart of the toolkit is this big felt chart that you hang on a wall, and it comes with all these little felt pieces, and you have people kind of come up and put up these little squares. And the way that it works is that bar represents income and rent, basically. So the top bar is annual income by thousands of dollars, and then the bottom bar shows what your affordable rent would be, or your affordable housing cost would be for that income level. And that affordability is based on 30% of your income, which is a number that comes from HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, but that's used in both state and local programs as well. So it's a number that kind of gets carried through all these different places. And then the other thing, I won't go into the technical details of this, but there's this other number called median family income that is another number that HUD calculates. And basically every housing program in the country is broken into categories based around that median family income number. So what we do is we use this chart to actually help people understand what median family income is, what it is in New York, how it relates to them and their neighborhood. And so those different colored bars correspond to that. which I won't go into, but we have people come up and put up these squares to populate the chart with information about their particular neighborhood. And when the chart is full, it might look something like this. So we start talking about whether this looks like how they imagine their neighborhood looking. So, yes, I think my neighborhood looks like that. I have lots of low-income families in my neighborhood, and there are not that many people who are up in this income category. Sometimes people are surprised by how it looks. So really what this tool does is facilitate conversations among people in a community about what their neighborhood is like now, what it's becoming like, and then looking at things like both housing costs and then affordability programs that apply to them. So those little, the things that look like little houses with numbers on them are rent tabs, and we use those. We have conversations with people about, well, what is the 1-bedroom cost in this neighborhood? What's a 2-bedroom cost, a 3-bedroom? And then we look at how that relates to who lives there. So in theory, if you look at the tab where the 1 is, anyone to the left of that amount of rent technically can't afford to live in the neighborhood. So we talk about what that means and how people are actually getting by. Things like they're paying more than 30% of their income, or they're doubling up, or they're living in substandard units. And these are things where we don't say those things. We sort of just ask questions and people answer them and start having conversations around them. And it's really impressive because people know all this stuff and they sort of kind of bring it to bear on the conversation pretty quickly. And then the other thing that happens is that we show them how the different affordability programs relate to their income levels in their neighborhood. And then we can look at things like proposed development and where it fits on this scale. And really within a 1-hour workshop, we get to the point where people will start saying things like, well, I think this affordability program in our neighborhood is maybe set at the right income level, but it needs to be broken up so that we make sure that it doesn't just, if it's 60 to 80% of median family income, that all the units are not for the 80% person and that there are some for the 60% person. So that's a pretty technical conversation. And, we're having it with young people, like elderly people, like, people who have never gone to a public meeting in their lives, that are just coming to these conversations and are interested in what's happening in their neighborhood. And so they're sort of paying attention and they're picking up like pretty specific information. So it's really exciting to actually go to these workshops and see what happens in them. The toolkit that we made also includes this little guidebook, which has uses graphics to break down the key issues. So this is looking at 30% of income and what that means. But it also has sort of a training section in the back so that you can read it and learn how to run a workshop yourself. And when we made the toolkit, we really made it for community organizations to use it. So it's meant to kind of just, you can open the box and learn how to use it yourself, but we also do a lot of training sessions if people are uncomfortable with it. And then when we finished making this toolkit, some of our community partners said, this is great, I really like it, I like having workshops, I don't have time to give workshops all the time. Sometimes I want to just take that information and show it to an elected official or show it to someone in Toronto City Planning, or just take it to a meeting with me. I wish there was a website where I could do the same thing. So we got funding and we built a website. So this is an interactive map. And it basically does the same thing as the chart did. So if you click on a neighborhood, you get this histogram at the bottom that's like what you would get with the felt squares on the actual chart. So you can see the income distribution for that neighborhood, and then you can put the little rent markers on it and see how that impacts the neighborhood. So here you can see that the units to the left gray out, so they're technically the ones that can afford to live there. And then you can export it as a PDF or print it and bring it to a meeting with you, or you can just use this and look at different neighborhoods. Sometimes people use it in workshops, so they'll actually do the workshop, look at the neighborhood that they're focusing on, but then use this to compare it to other neighborhoods so people get a sense of what's happening in other places. And then this is what it looks like all together. So it actually comes in a big red plastic box. And we've been distributing this now for 2 years, and our first run of them, we produced about 50 or so, and they're all gone, and we're well into our second run of them now, and we're working on adapting it for Chicago now. So those income numbers are specific to different cities, so we're working on adapting it for Chicago and working with a group of organizations out there that are going to use it now for workshops as well. So that's it. That's most of our current work there, and so anyway, I think we're going to open up to questions now. Yeah.